David Johnston.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I think, like lots of people, I was very surprised when I discovered that tips were not being passed on. I think our understanding has always been that you pay the amount of money on the menu for the food if you're in a restaurant, and the additional money you leave is about the service that you receive. We've all given particularly generous tips when we've had very good service. I dare say we may have given not so good, maybe no tip for particularly bad service, though never in the constituency, obviously, partly because there'd never be any bad service in my constituency, I hasten to add. So it sticks in the craw to think that someone may have worked so hard and then see no benefit of that hard work, that it would just be taken by the owner of the business. And particularly, there are peak periods like Christmas, for example, where the amount that is earned in tips can be a vital boost to the person's income for that month, maybe even for that year.
Would the honourable gentleman give way?
I will.
I'd like to thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. And in terms of the point he makes about being surprised that this is an issue, and I totally accept that, has he, in terms of the tipping that he's done, or people he knows, has he come across the issue of the difficulty sometimes? Do you put it onto the credit card, or do you give it in cash? And obviously, if it goes onto the credit card, how likely is it to get to the employee? Perhaps even less likely. Is that an issue that he's given a great deal of thought to?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention. At first, I thought he was going to ask me how much I leave in tips. So I was a bit concerned there. Obviously, I'm a very generous tipper. In case he does want to know. But I think
I'm very intrigued, Mr. Speaker, by my honourable friend's use of the word generous, as he describes himself as a generous tipper, and perhaps he could tell the House what he considers in percentage terms a generous tip.
Two questions.
Well, I'm even more grateful to that honourable friend for asking me that question. I think what I would say is I am probably not quite as generous as they are in the US, where now you get recommendations on your bill for sometimes 25–30% as a tip. But I would always err on the side of giving a good tip, even for average service, and an even better one for exceptional service.
Thank you. I very much appreciate him giving way. Just on that point, though, about US service, I think one of the comments I've had to me, and I'm sure the honourable friend from this morning has had similar ones, which is this moving us, is the tips are moving us towards a sort of US model? And I think the really important thing to note is that, again, as was stated earlier, this isn't about making tips part of the salary. It's, we want workers to have good salaries. Minimum wage has been increased again in announcements. It's about the top-up. It's the thank you. It's the gratuity on top to say thank you, rather than it being seen as part of a salary, which I think is something that's come up a few times. Thank you.
I think my honourable friend makes a couple of very important points. I mean, the first one about the US is it was a particularly bad practice where employers were using tips to try and meet the minimum wage. And we've made great strides in increasing the national minimum wage in national living wage in recent years. I think we've now hit £10.40, although the minister can correct me on that, or at least £10, I believe. So I think that's one particularly important thing. But the other thing is, if when we go into a restaurant and we buy a pizza and it says £10, that pizza's £10, And the member of staff, when we paid for that pizza, said, you know what, I'm going to take £2 of that £10 for the pizza. I'm just going to keep that for myself. There would be outrage about that. There would be outrage about the reverse situation. And it's right that we should feel very offended on behalf of staff who are working hard for these tips and not getting them. Now, I think my honourable friend, the member for Cheadle, is absolutely right. This is not just about hospitality, and I thought she made a very important point about nail bars, hairdressers, lots of things that I have many of in my constituency. But I do realise it is in large part about hospitality. I have a constituency with a lot of hospitality venues, pubs, for example. There are only 7 MPs in this place who have more pubs in their constituencies than I do. I've been trying to get round them all. I'm doing pretty well. And hospitality is an industry which is vital for the UK economy, but it's an industry that's particularly vital for younger workers. For ethnic minority workers, it's for part-time workers. It's a very accessible industry for people to get their foot on the ladder, to get some important skills. And it's hard work, often involving being on your feet all day, can be in very difficult conditions, can be dealing with very difficult customers. You may have long hours. And so it's vital, it's hard, you get good skills, and you should get all of your tips. Now, I should say that those employers, and I think people who've said this already are absolutely right, it is a small minority of employers that will be doing this, because most employers will feel like we do, that of course their staff should be given the tips for the work that they've done. So it will be a small minority. And they are shooting themselves in the foot in many ways, because where an employee has choice, and of course they don't always have choice, but where they have choice between different employers, chances are they're going to pick the one that's going to let them keep their tips rather than the one that won't let them keep their tips. And that would be a perfectly logical decision to make. It would probably be the decision that I made, because as we discussed earlier, just as the customer expects that the tip will go to the staff, I think staff think that wage may not be very high, but I'll be able to earn even more when it comes to tips. And this debate and this legislation reminded me of 2 other things which I think are relevant to this discussion and the passage of this legislation. And the first is unpaid internships. Now, the reason I say that is because the hope with this legislation was that employers would not wait for the legislation to take effect, and they would start to change their practices before the statutory code came into effect, because the attention on this issue would make it socially unacceptable for employers to be doing this. And I hope that has happened. And the reason it reminds me of unpaid internships is because these have been rife, unfortunately, in the UK. They've been rife in this place, by the way, and part of the reason that we were slow at first to make progress on getting rid of unpaid internships was that 2 groups that you often need for campaigns use them lots and lots. Politicians and the media are both usually very important for campaigns on issues. Both were using lots of unpaid internships. And when you looked across our professions, media, fashion, lots of other things, you found people working for no money. Now, what those employers would say is they were providing a great opportunity because people in those positions were getting skills that they would need later in the workplace. But the fact is, to do an unpaid internship, you've got to have a number of things that let you do that. One of those things is usually having to move to London because they're concentrated in London. You need accommodation for that. And you're doing work for that employer, so you need money from somewhere. You're either working 2 jobs then, one you're paid for and one you're not, or, which was often happening, it's the wealthiest families who can support their children doing those that are supplementing that. Those internships then lead to jobs, and then those jobs look very unrepresentative of the country as a whole because of who's getting into them. Again, a small proportion of employers doing these things, but because we shone a light on it in the way that we are with this legislation, and making it clear that actually it isn't acceptable for employers to be taking the tips of their staff, you hope that employers have already started to change their practices. But nonetheless, this legislation is very important, and I'm glad that I'm glad that we are bringing it in as we speak. The second issue it reminded me, though, of is access to cash. And this has already been touched on in people's speeches already. But we have this big challenge in the country at the moment about access to cash. We have banks that are closing their branches all over the country. We have cash points disappearing. We have an assumption that everybody wants to do everything by card, or they want to do everything online. And I get quite a number of constituents write to me, as I'm sure we all do. I get quite a number of constituents who write to me really concerned about this, because they really like to be able to use cash. They worry it's going to disappear. They don't know what they're going to do about it. And the reason this is relevant to this TIPS bill is because we've had the odd voice in the hospitality industry say that this bill is not a good thing, that there are cost pressures on the hospitality industry at the moment, that when people pay on card, the business is incurring fees for that card transaction, and therefore it's not right to let all the money go. I mean, their basic argument is they might tip on card, I'm paying money for that charge, and you're saying I've got to give the entire thing to the staff. And I'm afraid I'm hugely sympathetic to the hospitality industry in lots of ways. I'm not sympathetic to that particular point. But I do think it relates to access to cash. And we could all, by the way, do a better job of carrying cash. I mean, there's a national issue of how we ensure people who need it always have access to it. But we should all probably, to my honourable friend and member for Watford's point about this, you know, do I need to have cash to ensure that this person's going to get their tip? Well, no, as a result of this legislation. However, they might nonetheless appreciate it. And I'm afraid that where a place has become card only, I really don't agree with that. I accept it may be simpler for people to pay card, and particularly younger generations. I don't want to make any age-related comments because I know plenty of people in their 70s and 80s who like using contactless. But I do think that we could all do a better job of carrying cash so that tips could be paid in them and received in them. But one way or the other, this is a hugely important bill. I congratulate the member for Innismore and for Watford for the work that he did on this before. And I do think, although it's a small minority, we're doing a very important thing here to make sure that people are rewarded for the effort that they put in.